Welcome everybody to another exciting session in the A4Q Testing Summit 2024 edition. I'm delighted to introduce you to wonderful, experienced and passionate testing professionals, Jean-Francois Riverin and Sammy Kolluru, who I know will share a lot of great insight into the topic of the session, risk-based testing, evaluating and quantifying risk. Quickly, I'll just introduce Jean-Francois, who's the co-founder of Zentelia and an active member of the Canadian Software Testing Board, and Sammy Kolluru, who is from pivotal in setting up Imbus Canada and who is also part of the TMMI America organization. Chaps, I'm not going to delay any further, but hand over to you to get started with your presentation.
Thank you, Debbie, and hello, everybody. So here today, we're going to talk about the risk-based testing, which kind of is something really important to start with when you start in quality. So here you can see on the next slide the content that will be discussed. We're going to the principle, and which kind of principle? We're going at the basic, where we're assessing and measuring testing. Of course, there's controlling and surveillance after, but today we will just start by those basics that amazingly not everybody already knows. And so we will discuss two different methods presented by Sammy and I. Something about us quickly. As Debbie said, we're with the Canadian Software Testing Board in Canada, and a long time ISTQB practitioners with a lot of times and experience in QA. And if you want to chat with us after this presentation, feel free to go to the QR code. So you can scan the code and book a chat live with every one of us, anyone you want. So on the next slide today, we will discuss the why risk management is important. And you see I have something special today. I have a cowboy hat. Why do I have that? It's because I thought it was funny to represent the software development like we're doing reckless development sometimes, and we don't use the risk-based testing. But when I bought that in Texas a few months ago, they laughed at me when I said that. They saying, "Do you really think that a cowboy will survive riding a bull on a rodeo without a proper risk management, without training, proper training, practice, and they will avoid those risks? There's plan A, plan B, backup plans. They are really working on a thorough techniques and training. So it's a reminder. It's really a reminder now that in software testing, we should do like a cowboy. We should do the risk-based testing, and we should do it appropriately. What I mean with that is that we want to train for efficiency of your software, reliability, adaptability, flexibility, everything that will give you a way to prioritize your testing and make a sound decision making. On the next slide, you will see that why testing is necessary. It's because, like the cowboy, we want to practice often. We want to do it, and in software, it means testing. What kind of testing? The functional testing. When you do your function, your features, you want them to see if they're incorrect, and then make sure that you learn from your weaknesses and fix that before it's going in production. They could be incomplete, and you could also have problems with reliability, the performance of those features, usability, safety, security, and so on. So this is really important to reduce the risk, and testing is one of the 4 options that you have to reduce this risk. On the next slide, you will see why it's kind of important to assess that, and which today we will not going like we're in the STQB syllabus to the full length of what the risk-based testing is. We just want you to start doing it. So just think about it, assess it, measure it, so we will see how we identify, evaluate, and quantify those risks. And those risks on the next slide are really simple. It's about two attributes. It's which kind of damage could happen if you're riding a bull. What kind of damage you could have? What kind of risk are you taking with the new moves that you're doing? It seems for your features. And then what is the probability that you get hurt or you have wrong features in production causing damages? So impact and likelihood is the two simple attributes that we will discuss about. How we represent them? You can go on the next slide and see that it's really easy. You can have two axes and one from the likelihood, which kind of less likely to happen or maybe probable. And then you have the impact, which is the level of risk that you're taking. So low impact to severe impact. And of course, at the top right, you always have the most important risk. So just creating a table to start, it lets you create your your risk analysis. Then there's four main options that you will see on the next slide. The options is like back to the cowboy, the cowboy analogy that I did. Uh, you can do training, so you can practice. So for us in software industry, it means testing. So you can mitigate the risk by testing. So is the likelihood is going to happen being real or not? So you can test that, or you can just accept the risk. So risk acceptance is something maybe it's too costly. Maybe you have reduced the risk enough, so you can take the risk. You practice enough, you're good enough to go in production. Or there's two other options. You may work together with them. You can transfer the risk to some insurance, so maybe to cover some fees, some financial problems, like you have a flood on your computer farm, you have compensation for that, or also you can have a contingency plan. If the risk happen, what do you do with when it happens? Do you have a backup plan, a contingency, and how do you work with that? How do you put that in place? And for sure, those four options can work together. You can have the contingency plan and you need to test it to make sure that the day you want it, like what happens with CrowdStrike and Delta, your contingency plan can work and you can use it. Then I will represent some tables on the next slide. How can we use, as soon as we decide that we are going to test, what kind of test you want to do? So it depends. It depends if there's a lot of impacts. So you do the business risk. So if business risks are important, you put them on the chart. Or if the technical risk is important, you put them on another chart. So then you have four quadrants that you can decide on which kind of test you are going to do. And of course, there's always the five quadrants that we put in place when some time is life critical. So you can put the fifth quadrant there. Going further, what it looks like on the next slide is on the right side, on the impact side, so which is on the right, is business risk. So business risk, how can you leverage them is by system and acceptance testing. So you put emphasis on the business risk. If you go on the top is the technical risk, is by practicing, is by testing often, testing what? The component and the integration. So every technical part of your software going to be tested. Just to look at that, what is going to do on the next slide is the one about the business risk. So the business risk, the fourth quadrant, and you start where? By the quadrant number 2. It's always on the quadrant number 2, where's the less risk and the highest risk and the highest likelihood that something will happen. So what kind of test you do at this in this quadrant? The main and alternative use cases, the decision table. Then you can go down and do different tests, so you can lower the testing and end up on the third quadrant, where mainly the main use cases can be done and you don't have to do a thorough testing if you're going down to the third quadrant. If you look on the next slide about what it means if you're trying to reduce the technical risk, then technical risk, as we said, can be reduced by component and integration testing. So you start in quadrant number 2 again, but then you go up instead of going down. You go on the left side, on the top of your of the quadrant. So in quadrant number 1, and then 4 and 3. So we will see that in the demo later on. What kind of testing with the real example we can reduce and how can we do that? But you just choose the right level of testing. On the next slide.
Okay. Thank you, Jean-Francois. That was really very informative about the risk-based, and especially from the business and the product. As we know from Jean-Francois' insight, risk-based testing is very crucial for both management as well as for the development team because there are numerous advantages, including prioritizing, efficiency, reliability, flexibility, and adaptability, which Jean-Francois already discussed them. So we as a development team and also the management team use those risk information to prioritize your test. Especially from management, risk-based testing will ensure that resources are allocated to the highest risk areas using the risk matrix that you see on the screen. And also it will help to optimize the budget and prevent any costly defects later in the cycle. And for the development team, risk-based testing will enable to focus on most critical and high-risk areas. So this will lead to more efficient and effective testing. So talking about this matrix, as we know, risk matrix will show how the risks are covered, just like Jean-Francois talked about. I'm going to cover more into the evaluating and the assessment of those risks. The one way to assess the risk and evaluate them is by using a qualitative determination of the risk level. It's one of the simplest way to determine them, just like Jean-Francois talked about, is a likelihood. How likely can this happen? And also the impact. If it does happen, what would happen? Like how much damage can it cause? So we can use a very simple qualitative determination, which is a low, average, or high, or very high. Normally, likelihood is three variations of degree would be better, because you can just say some risk is very high that would impact us, or some risk could be very low because it may not have any impact. It may have some impact to the customer, but it may not obstruct their day-to-day activities. So the risk determination can be used using the matrix by determining the qualitative determination. And the next slide would talk about risk evaluation and execution. In the risk execution, when you're looking at those criteria by which prioritized test cases are executed based on the risk is one of the most important criteria. Based on the risk level, test cases can be prioritized and they can be executed with a number of options available. One way to execute them is by filtering them by priorities. In filtering them by priorities, test cases or test suites, they can be filtered to contain only certain types of risk. Remember the risk matrix we talked about, very high risk or medium risk or low risk. Here we can prioritize, only show me the high risk or very high risk so that I can execute them first and remove all the critical risky areas to begin the project. Also, another option that is available is by sorting by priorities. In sorting of priorities, which is one of the most common way to prioritize your execution, is to sort your risk according to their degree of risk levels, such as high risk, and then we go to the medium risk execution, then you go to the low risk execution. So this will allow the management team as well as a test team to determine what type of risk needs to be covered and to when and how they need to be managed. And in the next slide, we will talk about the execution. There are general approaches available, as we talked about. One is the priority and the sorting them, and other ways to when it comes to execution, there are a number of approaches available. One of the common approaches are depth first testing. In the depth first testing, as the name implies, all the high risk areas are executed first. We are going depth wise. Remember, we sorted the risk at high, medium, and low. Now during a depth first execution, we will execute all the risks that are very high, strictly following the risk orders. Then we go to the medium risk, and then we go to the low risk, and if the time permits. There's another approach, which is a breadth first testing. Here, we can select a sample of those risks. For example, we can select some high risk areas, some low risk areas, some medium risk areas for different components and different functionalities, so that we have wholesome coverage of different types of risk levels for any given functionalities. So these are the approaches that is available as a development team as well as the management team to decide what risk needs to be managed first. In the next slide, we will be talking about the approaches. It is possible that time that is allocated for testing may not be enough to execute all the test cases. That is why we have to prioritize them and execute them based on the risk levels. Even when some of the tests are not executed, we can still use a risk-based approach. This will allow the testers to report to the management team in terms of any additional risk that may be available even after executing all your tests. Whenever a tester team want to report any additional risk level that is not been addressed, they have to report in such a way that every stakeholder in the project, they can understand the degree of risk level and also the impact of those risks. Keep in mind, when reporting those risks, they have to be in a very simple, natural language, not technical language, so that everyone in the team can understand, including the technical team as well as the management team or any other stakeholders. So these informations will allow the management team to decide whether to extend testing, or at some point, you might even have to transfer those risks to the end users or even to the operational staff or the production staff to deal with them later on in the project. So this decision will help the management team to ensure the project moves seamlessly from the get-go, from the start of the project until all the way to the release time. Making this release-based decision based on the residual risk is very important, especially from the management team. So once those decision has been made, in the next slide, we will talk about a little bit of strategy. During test planning, the test strategies are defined based on the risks. Those are the ones we just talked about from the management as well as from the development team. And also keep in mind, the cost has to be weighed against those risk reduction. Not all risks are worthy of fixing them during the development cycle. So these informations will help the management team as well as development team to select the right type of test objectives based on the project, right? What test needs to be performed and when need to be performed. Also, this will help in selecting the test object. What functional areas has to be tested first and followed by what object. As well, from the test team point of view, these risk-based informations will help them to select the test approaches, whether it's going to be methodical testing by using all the black box testing approaches or using the experience-based testing. So the risk-based strategy will help the test team as well as the development team to select the right type of objectives on the object as well as the test approaches. When it comes to the management team, cost is very important because management team has to ensure the project cost remains within the assigned budget. So balancing the test cost against those risks as well as balancing the test coverage is very crucial. Talking about risk-based approach, in the next slide, we'll be talking about risk-based testing. In risk-based testing, doesn't matter whether if you're working on the traditional sequential model, such as waterfall or the V model, or even the agile models. The planning and the managing those risks are very similar, except there might be a few variations based on whether you're using a sequential model or the agile model. In the model, I'm going to talk about, in the next slide, I'm going to talk about different types, risk approaches. For example, in the next slide, I will be talking about sequential model. In the sequential model, the risk-based testing starts right from the get-go. That is from the analysis of the product risk, which you can also call them as a quality risk. Based on those product risks, you can create a master test plan or any other test plan, additional test plans that might be necessary. For example, functional test plan or non-functional test plan. These tests are created based on the test plan. They are designed, implemented, and executed in order to cover those risks that has been identified during the analysis stage. If you find higher risk areas, more meticulous the test execution would be, such as using a decision table or any black box method techniques. Or if it's a low risk area, then the test would be less meticulous, such as using experience-based testing or exploratory testing. When it comes to agile, in the next slide, risk analysis can be performed at two different levels. One is at the release level. During release level, remember, in the agile projects, you're planning for the entire release of the cycle. It could be 6 months long. In this risk analysis, business representatives might provide any high-level risk overview of the risk for the entire user stories. And the whole team, we call them as a three amigos, including the business team, development team, as well as customer team. They can assist the business representatives to identify and assess any risk. When it comes to the iteration level or at the sprint level planning, whole team will identify and assess in detail for those risks identified per user stories. They will list all the backlog items based on the current risk level. Higher the risk, higher the backlog, higher the priority of those backlogs, and identify any product risk associated with those backlogs, and assess and identify the risk associated with them, including the quality risk as well as the business risk, and finally to select the right type of test approaches. Okay, so now we will do a little bit of demo on the risk management.
Thank you. And as we mentioned, we have two kind of demo. No matter how you are identifying and evaluating your risk, there's always some models that exist. So you can start with, and we present two to let you know that, there's different way to do it, but at least start doing it. It's really important. Don't start your testing without knowing what you're doing. So the one that I will present, it's really based on something related to software. So the Prisma approach has been developed by Eric Van Vinendal. If you know, you can know him by the TMMI, the test maturity model that he helps develop for a long time. So on the Prisma, on the next slide, what we're doing in testing, where do we start in the risk analysis? You start with the impact factors. Impact factors could be a number on a scale that as I showed me and Sammy who showed earlier, but it can also have multiple factors. I think we will all talk about that. So what kind of factors are you using to evaluate your impact depends on you. But here is an example. You can put criticality of the impact. So what is the prejudice and the cost of the failure? Visibility, is it visible to the client or not? If it's hidden, maybe it's more important. And what is the weight that you put on this factor could determine the value that you put on the risk. On the next slide, you will evaluate the probability factor. So in your risk analysis, you determine how it's probable, and how you determine that depends on some factors that are represented here. You can go on the complexity, the size of the software or the feature that you're doing. Is it probable that it use a new software, a new method, a new classes or new technology? So you can put a number of factors there, and you put a weight on those factors. That will give you then on the next slide, you can go on a list of factors that will be evaluated. Who's going to evaluate those factors? It's a good question, because usually what we see, it's the QA are going to this presentation, looking at that, say, oh, it's right, it's good, we can use that. And they put the value on the impact and probability. They create a chart, say, okay, here's the priority of my testing. But you should not do that this way. You should at least have two profiles of experts, something that is aware of what's going on in the business, so we make the right evaluation on the impact, and what is the technical side of my business? Am really at risk? Is it probable that it happens? How do you put a number on that? You ask the business people and the technical people, and at least one in each of the factors. And if you have more on the attributes, and if you have more people available, then on the next slide, what you can do is you can consolidate the risk evaluation. So as a QA, you can just work on that, get the right people giving you the right information, and you can evaluate different types of risk. functional, non-functional, the performance, usability, and you put a number, and then you have the impact number and the likelihood. Here's an example about a point of sale system where a client can choose to do a transaction with different banks. Is there an impact if he cannot do it? What is the number of the impact for your business? So it really depends on your business. And is there any probability? So you put a number, like in this one, the first one, 3.2 and 1.8, you have a multiplier, and then you have a value, 5.76. And you can do that for all the examples, for 6 examples that I have here. And you report those examples. Remember, as I talked before on the quadrants, so on the next slide, you report those risks with the number on the right quadrant. So let's say the number 1 is on high impact, less likelihood, so it becomes on the number on the quadrant number 4, and then the risk number 4 is the top one, so is at the top right corner, so is on the quadrant number 2, and so on for all of the risk. Then on the next slide, I will show you how do you prioritize that on the business risk. So on quadrant number 2, you start really at the right, so on the quadrant number 2, and then the quadrant number 4, 1, and 3. If you are evaluating based on the probability first, the likelihood on the next slide, you're doing the quadrant number 2, 1, 4, and 3. Which means that you won't do the same test for the same reason, and you put the emphasis where it's important. If it's a high impact, you put the emphasis on the business side, so with the system and acceptance testing. And if it's the likelihood, the probability that you want to reduce, then you put the risk. You test them by starting by the component and integration testing. Which leads to the next slide where we have a system and component, and it's a guideline that you can create depending on the level of risk and the risk type. So if there's a low risk, so the quadrant number 3, you do less testing or less thorough testing. And where that there's the high risk, then you know which kind of test you want to apply. So it helps you decide, even if you're in Agile, you can do that without doing that by risk. You can do that by story and say, oh, it's a high risk story, so here's the test that I've defined for performance, usability, functional testing, or any component that you want to test. And if you go to the next slide, you will see then that we'll be able to put the quadrant and the test focus, and then you create your test. So what is good, it's you can create a risk mitigation matrix, and then you have something visual, which is the risk burn down chart with the number that you have, and as soon as the test pass, then you reduce the risk. So yeah, if you have to take a decision at sprint number 7, then you know that you can go on because the risk is at this level, and you know exactly which kind of risk you're taking. Then we go to the next slide, and with Sammy.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So the another model, now it is option. Now I understand the risk-based approach. Now what model do I select? One is the Prisma, what Jean-Francois talked about. There's another model called ACC model. This is a model developed by the Google. I had opportunity to work with one of their team, and they developed this model, and it has been adapted throughout the Google, and we thought it could be a very interesting model. So ACC actually stands for attributes, components, and capabilities. Going to the next slide, I will talk about each of them. For any risk-based approach, you have to start with a plan. It could be a master plan, or it could be any individual plan, like a test plan. In the master plan, you have to start with the user stories or epics or features, doesn't matter. You have to determine what features you're going to select, and then you have to determine what type of testing approach, whether it's going to be done by the test team or it could be done by the entire development team. And you have to determine the requirements for the environments, test environment basically, as well as any utilities, additional utilities that might be required, such as data or any tools that might be necessary. Then you have to determine the dependencies or performance consideration, especially, for example, if you want to talk about stress test or if you want to talk about performance test, that also has to be considered in your planning. Once the planning is done, the next slide will talk about attributes. Attributes are nothing but the adjectives. For example, what are some of the adjectives that I need to describe about the features that I have selected? For example, one of the objective could be the feature should be extensible, or it should be reliable, or it should be customizable, or it could be easy. In the adjective, this is one of the A in the ACC, which is the attributes. You have to determine what is that my feature supposed to be doing. Right? In the next slide, we will talk about C, which is components. Components are the actual components of your product. These components could be a button, a link, or could be entire module. Here you determine what are the components available and little bit explanation about those components. What is the purpose of these components? So 1A is the attributes and the second A is the components. Once you determine the components, attributes, and the components, in the next slide, we will talk about the combinations of them, including attributes such as whether it's easy or customizable and what components are we working with. You determine the capabilities. So this is the C within the ACC model. The last C stands for the capabilities. In the capabilities, we determine for these attributes, for these component levels, what is the capability of these functionalities. Once you have these three structures, put them in a matrix or in the model, now you can determine what are the likelihood and also the impact of these capabilities. Likelihood can be, it could be high, medium, or low. You can use your own conventions, or the impact, it could be very high all the way up to the low. So once you have determined the likelihood and the impact, in the next slide, we will show you the heat map, or you can also call them as a risk matrix. Here, based on the risk assessment you just provided, such as the high, medium, or low, you have a heat map which shows what area is most important. If you look on the screen, there are certain product which is a very high risk. For example, extensible for a model, like a special model. They are shown in red. That means there are very high risk areas. Those tests has to be done first before you can move on to the next level. When it shows the yellow, that means it's a low risk. If the time permits, we can manage them. If not, we can pass it on to the customer. And when you see the green, that means those are very low risk that doesn't affect a business, day-to-day business for a customer. So based on this heat map, management team as well as the development team can all make a decision what area needs to be focused first. Okay. In the next slide, here comes the test cases. Remember, we as a test team, we have to manage test cases. Now we can start assigning our test cases based on those capabilities. And we call this as a traceability matrix. So we know exactly what are the high risk areas based on the risk map. And we know what are the capabilities. Capabilities are nothing but the functional areas, functionalities that needs to be performed, and you assign test cases for those capabilities. So now we cover the risk as well as the test cases. So this whole sum is called ACC model, which is one of the easiest model and much easy to manage your test traceabilities. And the next slide would be a little Q&A from us. If you have any questions, please let us know, and we will be more than happy to discuss about them.
Thank you very much both for a very insightful session there. Lots of good information, as always. Just quickly for people who are watching, because you're jam-packed there with insight and useful stuff. So A4Q will make the recordings available on its website. So for anybody who wants to start to tune in again and pick up on some of the stuff that you've spoken about. I think we've got some questions and we'll get those on screen now. So you can read it yourself. I'm working in Agile. How does risk-based testing integrate with my current processes?
It's a good question. I think I will take this one. I would like to answer for who is asking that being Agile doesn't mean no planning. In fact, Agile is a great tool to mitigate risk. It's already embedded in Agile. If you use the ceremony, it's again a great starting point. Look at that. Think just about sprint planning. It gives you the opportunity to plan your risk and do the risk-based testing first. I will not stress enough that risk-based testing is really important because it's how you will prioritize and choose the test that you are going to do. So it will be less costly and more efficient. You really need to do that and use this opportunity as the sprint planning to do it. And even the daily scrums will be able to monitor if there is a new risk or if your risks are more likely than you thought, because you use the result of your testing to survey and to control what's going on. So it's really important to do that, and then just use the product risk, math risk, associate at least each story. If you don't have time, just associate each story to a quadrant, and then you know which kind of tests you need to do. At least you can do that.
Thank you. Thank you. What are the potential challenges to using the tools that have been presented?
Yeah, right. A solid question here. I think that the first thing that we will get is the team will probably not buy in first. They will see that maybe as another tool, a management tool, time consuming. So I will advise to start with a phase approach. Start small. Just do one team. Just do one thing. Just start with your champion. Use champions that already know that there's problems if you don't do that, and try to put that in place by showing how it works and the benefits of the tool. So if you are able to see the benefits, that the quality is higher, the team is more efficient doing that way, people will start using it.
That makes a lot of sense. Kenza, do we have another question? Yep. Risk is a topic nobody on my project seems interested in discussing. How should I approach this issue?
I can take this question. This has been a very common theme throughout any project. Many people do believe the risk-based testing is, solely a matter of management, and as a development team, we don't need to be involved. That's not true. Managements are responsible, as well as a development team. Developers are testing, both are responsible for managing the risk. The way you can involve them, your management team, is to start explaining why you should be interested in risk. That is to leverage the risk to shape the planning, the test planning, as well, and also design the test. That is creating a test catalog, such as, what type of risk you might find. It could be business risk. What happens if we delay the project? Or if it's a quality risk, what happens if certain functionality doesn't work? Once you identify and once you categorize them into different type of risk, then the management team will be much more interested in having a discussion around those risks, right? Especially items that are worthy of testing needs to be discussed, and by asking questions, like just asking open-ended questions, such as, can this problem occur in production? And if it does occur, what do we do? Once we have those type of conversations, you start those conversations, your management team and any stakeholders will be much more interested in having those discussions.
Thank you, Sammy. Thank you. Time for one more question, I think. Oh, my list of potential risks are all mixed up. How should I prioritize it? It's a good question.
Yes, again, as we talked about, involving the management and the stakeholders, this is again one of the most common issues in any project is we have collection of risk, but they're all mixed up. We don't know what to do with that, right? The best way, as I explained in the previous question, is to create a catalog, different types of risk catalog. One is a business risk, one is a product risk. Sometimes you can also create like a functional risk or a performance risk, or even a human risk, right? Doesn't matter. Whatever risk you find them, you identify them, put them in a different catalog, and then assign ownership for those catalog. For example, if it's a business risk, then the business stakeholders are responsible. And if it's a product risk, then the product teams are responsible. Once you assign that ownership, risk-based testing will not become a concern for the management team because everybody would be involved. Remember, risk-based testing doesn't mean only the testing team are responsible. It is the wholesome approach. Other teams, such as management team or product team or development team, they can be involved in assessing any type of risk. If it's a business risk or a human risk, management team can deal with them. If it's a quality risk, test team can prioritize and assign the test based on either Prisma model or ACC model. You can identify them and you can assign and prioritize your test based on them. Right. So again, if you have a many risks that are mixed up together always create a catalog of different types of risk. Doesn't matter how many catalogs you have, as long as you have a ownership for those catalog, it will become much more easy to manage them.
Just to dig a little bit further, so once you catalog them, the actual prioritization should fall out of that?
That's right. So once you have a different catalog, and again, your risk should be ordered in terms of priority. This is one of the term I talked before, is sort by priorities. Higher the list, that means higher the priorities. That means that has to be dealt with them first, and then go according to the order. Yeah, you're right, Debbie.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much both for that session. As I say, people will be able to watch again via the website. I'm sure A4Q will share a lot of information about it after the event. Sammy, Jean-Francois, thank you for your time. To everybody watching, we do have a vote for your favorite presentation. I think Jean-Francois with his hat deserves an extra little mark there. Yeah, thank you. And stay tuned, everybody, for the next session in the A4Q Summit 2024 edition. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the opportunity.
It's a pleasure.
Bye.